Welcome to this afternoon's Opera Insights talk. Today I will be discussing Hansel and Gretel. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bob Kingston and I'm Portland Opera's historian and lecturer. Before we get started, I have a couple of quick announcements. First of all, I want to remind you about the back talk today, about 10 or 15 minutes after the final curtain. Portland Opera's General Director, Christopher Mattaliano, will be available downstairs to answer questions you have about the production. Chris usually has someone connected with the performance, a cast member or someone involved with production, so that's a good opportunity for you to debrief after the performance. I also want to remind you, next Friday evening, 7 o'clock at Sherman Clay over in the Pearl District, another installment of Destination Opera. Really very interesting programs. I've participated in a couple of them as panelist and guest, and they always offer really interesting insights into the operas that we're doing on the main stage. So that's 7 o'clock at Sherman Clay over in the Pearl District. One other announcement I want to make today, some of you have probably noticed this little setup down here. Starting today, we're going to be recording all of the Sunday talks for podcasts, which will be available on Portland Opera's website. So you are now part of history, right? You ask a question, it's going to be on here. I'm really excited about this. I think it's a terrific opportunity to communicate what the company does to a broader audience, family and friends who can't come to the show on Sunday but are planning on coming later in the week, or just people who can't come. So this is a great opportunity for them to hear what the company does and to get an idea of the company's commitment to education and outreach. So, pay no attention to the camera. I'll try not to make it too obtrusive, although if I stop and wave, you'll know why. I was thinking today about Hansel and Gretel. We were actually having a little breakfast discussion this morning, and I was looking at the cover of one of the CDs that I have. I remember this particular recording, which was done in 1971, back from its old LP days, and they've reproduced the LP cover on the booklet that comes with the CD. It's a great recording, by the way. It's Anna Moffo, Helen Donat, Christa Ludwig is the witch, Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau. Yeah, it's a fantastic recording. Arlene Auger and Lucia Popp are sort of dream cast. It's really outstanding, and it's available on RCA. The top of the cover of this says the world's most favorite children's opera performed by an all-star cast. And then in the middle of the cover is a gingerbread house. And we have lemon drops and orange rinds and all kinds of things on this gingerbread house. And I began thinking about assumptions and expectations that we have. Many of you know that I've brought this topic up in the past. We come to a performance armed with a set of assumptions and expectations about what we'll see and hear. And I think Hansel and Gretel is a good opera for testing our assumptions. The story is one that we've grown up with. It's part of kind of our culture of story that we hear as children. And it's so familiar to us that I think it's easy to believe that it's always been, that basically it's this sort of static thing that's come down over time, and that what Humperdinck did when he wrote this opera is just simply take the story and translate it into a different medium. But the opposite is the case, and I want to talk today about some of the differences between the Grimm story, or actually Grimm stories, and I'll explain that in a second, and the opera. I'm going to throw a couple of dates out at you. Don't worry, I'm not going to quiz you on these, but they help give you a little bit of context for the history of this story and the evolution from the very first instances when the Grimms wrote this down up through the end of the 19th century when it became an opera. And the first date is 1810. In 1810, Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm wrote down for the very first time a story that was relayed to them, most likely by a young middle-class woman named Dortchen Wild. Dortchen eventually married Wilhelm, and she was part of a family that the Grimm brothers had come in contact with. Like most of the people who relayed these stories to the Grimm brothers, they were reasonably well off. The misconception about the Grimm brothers is that they went out into the woods and they knocked on peasants' doors and they listened to 300-year-old women tell these stories. In fact, the Grimms were academics. They were law students, and they also studied a branch of linguistics called philology, which looks at how language evolves over time. And they had people come to them. And most of the people who were relaying these stories to the Grimm brothers were middle-class or upper-middle-class women. These are stories that they had heard from their grandmothers or from their nannies and had become part of their storytelling consciousness. So in 1810, the Grimm brothers wrote out 53 stories in manuscript form, which they were going to contribute to a collection of fairy tales that was published under the title of Des Knaben Wunderhorn. If you know Gustav Mahler, that name is going to be familiar because Des Knaben Wunderhorn served as the basis for a number of poems that he set starting in the 1880s. Well, nothing ever came of this, but the story was written down in its barest form, as it was dictated from this woman, Dortchen Wild. And I want to read the opening of this from 1810, just to give you an idea of sort of the beginning of the Hansel and Gretel story. There was once a poor woodcutter who lived in front of a great forest. He fared so miserably that he could scarcely feed his wife and his 2 children. Once he had had no bread any longer and suffered great anxiety. Then his wife said to him in the evening in bed, "Take the 2 children tomorrow morning into the great forest, give them the bread we have left, and make a large fire for them. After that, go away and leave them alone." The husband did not want to for a long time, but the wife left him no peace until he finally agreed. So that's the starting point of that 1810 version. A couple of things you may notice about that. The children have no names. And in fact, the title of this story is not Hansel and Gretel, but The Little Brother and the Little Sister. We also get very little information about this family other than the fact that they're poor. We don't have any sense of the relationship between the man and the woman. And at various times in the history of this story, she's either a mother or a stepmother. And we get only the barest outline of the father's reluctance to take the children out. 2 years later, here's the second date, 1812, is the first year that the Grimms publish their stories. And this is that opening in 1812, just 2 years later. Next to a great forest there lived a poor woodcutter who had come upon such hard times that he could scarcely provide daily bread for his wife and his 2 children, Hansel and Gretel. Finally, he could no longer even manage this, and he did not know where to turn for help. One evening, as he was lying in bed worrying about his problem, his wife said to him, "Listen, man, early tomorrow take the 2 children, give each of them a little piece of bread, then lead them into the middle of the thickest part of the woods, make a fire for them, and leave them there, for we can no longer feed them." "No, woman," said the man, "I cannot bring myself to abandon my own children to wild animals that would quickly tear them to pieces." "If you don't do it," said the woman, "all of us will starve," and she gave him no peace until he said yes. So in just 2 years, that basic story has evolved. We now have dialogue, we have the children with names, we have motivation. The characters begin to take some sort of life. The last date I'll mention for the Grimms, 1857. This is the final edition of their fairy tales as published. Here's that opening. A poor woodcutter lived with his wife and his 2 children on the edge of a large forest. The boy was called Hansel and the girl Gretel. The woodcutter did not have much food around the house, and when a great famine devastated the entire country, he could no longer provide enough for his family's daily meals. One night, as he was lying in bed and thinking about his worries, he began tossing and turning. Then he sighed and said to his wife, "What's to become of us? How can we feed our poor children when we don't even have enough for ourselves?" "I'll tell you what," answered his wife. "Early tomorrow morning, we'll take the children out into the forest where it's most dense. We'll build a fire and give them each a piece of bread. Then we'll go about our work and leave them alone. They won't find their way back home, and we'll be rid of them." "No, wife," the man said, "I won't do this. I don't have the heart to leave my children in the forest. The wild beasts would soon come and tear them apart." "Oh, you fool," she said. "Then all 4 of us will have to starve to death. You'd better start planing the boards for our coffins." She continued to harp on this until he finally agreed to do what she suggested. But still, he said, "I feel sorry for the poor children." So between 1810 and 1857, almost 50 years, the story has evolved. In the first versions, the wife has the husband take the children out. But in this version, she says, "We'll take them out." Now that's important because all of a sudden, this woman is involved in this story to an extent that she hadn't been before. She's implicated in this process of child abandonment. By 1857, there was also a more direct link between the evil of this mother, stepmother, and the witch. So again, a process of evolution. Now what about the opera? Well, in the opera, the husband is not a woodcutter, he's a broom salesman. Why would this be? Well, the opera premiered in 1893. A woodcutter was a bit of an archaic job in 1893. A broom salesman, someone who sold a product in an industrial environment where there was lots of dirt and soot, well, that made more sense. So even as the opera begins to take shape, we see a transformation. I mentioned the gingerbread house, and we sort of assume that this gingerbread house has always been there. Well, in fact, I've looked at every version of the Grimm tale as published, and there is not one reference in there to a gingerbread house. Not one. The house is actually made of bread. And that makes sense. Bread is an important part of this story. Bread is daily sustenance for an agrarian society. Those of you who know the story will remember that the children are taken out into the woods not once, but twice. The first time, Hansel drops pebbles on the ground. Remember that? Well, that's not in the opera. The second time, breadcrumbs. And what happens to the breadcrumbs? The birds eat them. The house, the witch's house, is made of bread with cake on the roof and sugar around the windows. Where did this gingerbread thing come from? It's not in the opera. There's nothing in the opera that indicates this has to be a gingerbread house. Well, I think it actually comes from a couple of other stories. One was published in Poland, and another one was from Moravia, which is the area south of Germany. And in both of those, we have a reference to a gingerbread house. And those were later in the 19th century when those were finally collected. At some point, and it's very difficult to know when this happens, someone decided that this story needed to have a gingerbread house. And I suspect that what happened is that the gingerbread house was introduced in some sort of visual component, like a drawing or a painting. And then that eventually became sort of how we think